Good afternoon, everyone. As Kirsty just said there, my name is Amanda Bryan and I'm the chair for this afternoon's session, our first session this afternoon. As you're aware, Beyond COP26 is focusing on practical steps to achieving net zero. And as we're all becoming much more aware of how our decisions, large and small, shape both our own communities and those elsewhere, this conference is enabling us to ask questions about how our individual actions will impact the world around us and helping us in terms of how we take decisions to address that. Following on really neatly from the previous session, which was building net zero spaces and places, we're now going to be focusing on challenges and opportunities, natural capital. And in this discussion session, we're going to be exploring collectively how we can increase the utilisation of timber, which is essentially the ultimate net zero construction material. Over the last 100 years, Scotland has seen its tree cover increase from less than 5% of the land area to it's now sitting at around 19%. And with really ambitious woodland creation targets of 18,000 hectares per annum by 2024, and that's in Scotland. The intention is to get to 30,000 hectares per annum of new woodland creation across the UK. We're certainly going to have a good supply of this very green material, green building material for decades to come. First of all, this afternoon, we're going to hear from each of our three panellists. They're going to give us their thoughts on both the challenges and opportunities to really embed the use of timber. And then we're going to open it up to questions and discussions. So without any further ado, I'm going to introduce our three panellists. First of all, we have Professor Robert Heerstans, and Robert is the founding director of the Centre for Advanced Timber Technology. We then have Dr. Mila Duncheva, who, as you see, is joining us from a train speeding across the border. And Mila is the interim director of the Centre for Offsite Construction and Innovative Structures. And last but not least, we then have Eddie Balfour, who is one of the joint managing directors of James Jones and Sons. So first of all, I think I'm going to hand over to Robert. So Robert, if you could give us your initial thoughts on the topic at hand.
Yeah, sure. Thanks very much. I mean, I think it's very relevant given where we are, obviously, in the grips of a climate crisis. We know that construction is one of the main contributors to that, consuming up to 50% of non-renewable resource, and that's with respect to delivery. And then obviously when these buildings are in situ, there's the energy that they consume as we live, work, or do whatever we are within them, and ultimately we spend 80 to 90% of our time within the built environment. So it obviously has a huge impact on our lives. And with respect to this, we obviously need to change course drastically and think about it, how it can not only be delivered more sustainably, but how these buildings can ultimately perform when they're in situ, and equally how that can also impact upon the health and well-being of our lives, which of course again could be no more compelling at the moment given where we are with respect to coming out of a pandemic. So timber, renewable natural capital, of which timber is obviously a key material within, can respond to all of this. Trees grow, you sequestrate carbon, you lock that carbon in for longer, and obviously the built environment is an obvious opportunity to do that. Then we have that carbon locked in for a minimum of 50 years, given the regulatory requirements behind buildings, but of course they last a lot longer than that, as long as we design and build them with durability maintenance in mind. And if we do that through factory-based approaches, using industrialised approaches, that creates social and economic benefit at the same time, and offers, creates opportunity for job and wealth creation. So once those buildings are in play, we should have a fabric first approach. So that fabric sequestrates carbon and then has a high level of thermal performance, thermoacoustic, structural performance and durability as well. So in that respect, they last a long time. and at the same time they retain energy in a sense, because you don't need to utilise a lot to heat them, right? And then, of course, we know that biophilic approaches, so using natural surroundings, is good for our health and well-being. So therefore, it has those attributes as well. And for those that are lucky enough to live in or work in timber-based buildings, then we know that it's a good environment to live and work within. And that's borne out through studies as well that show things like the educational attainment is improved because, heart rate drops in education and concentration spans improve. So essentially, as an all-round piece, it has a lot to give. And it's as long as we think of the longevity of it, the whole life cost, and to that end, what happens at the end of life in line with the theories of circularity. So disassembly, reutilisation, and maximising the value return from what we do. And critically, that can all respond to the climate crisis. We just have to change and start doing it as of now, if not before now. So yeah, that would be my initial thoughts on this topic. So thanks very much for including me.
Okay, thanks very much, Robert. Mila?
Thank you very much, Amanda, and it's really interesting to hear the points that Robert raised. Yes, so for me, natural capital in the built environment is a lot about resource efficiency. How can we build our buildings as resource efficient as possible? And in that case, looking at materials resources, but also human resources per resources. And that's because I think we're all sold on the environmental benefits of building with timber, but we do still have almost a battle to fight when it comes to the cost of construction, or to the resources, the financial resources that we need to spend on construction projects. And so for me, studies have actually shown that timber is very, very efficient in activity, so that includes time spent on site, as well as waste materials produced in terms of materials used. So for me, that resource efficiency piece is really important, and as Robert pointed out, it does link up very nicely with the circular economy. Now that's a current advantage or benefit, but we do also have some challenges at the moment, maybe with the procurement of buildings, and how can we actually embed as a material within, let's say, net zero targets for procurement. How can we measure that, but also embed it in the current procurement process to encourage more people to build out of timber. Thank you.
Welcome. Okay, thanks, Mila, with some extra input from whichever rail company you're travelling with today. So thanks for that. Eddie, you're obviously involved in the business of producing construction timber. If you could give us your thoughts, that'd be great. Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Amanda, and good afternoon to everyone. I guess I've got three main points here. The first one really is regarding the type of trees we're planting, and I think there's a lot of talk and encouraging that we're getting the government now to see trees as a fantastic way of sequestrating carbon. But I guess from our point, we may need to make sure that we're recognizing that productive, actively managed forests will capture more carbon at a faster rate than an unmanaged, unproductive forest area. And it's really ensuring that the government policies and grant schemes are aligned to that, and it's putting the right trees in the right place. But we've got to have the right trees as an industry to be able to produce the construction products that will feed into to what we're trying to achieve here. So that's the first point. The second point I'd like to make was regarding we're talking about net zero with timber, but in fact it's a positive impact. The more timber we use in construction, the more carbon is locked in. Every commercial forest, whenever we fell trees, we're replanting them, so that cycle is continually reabsorbing carbon from the atmosphere. So it's I can't think of another industry where the more activity we've got, the more carbon we're absorbing from the atmosphere. So it's a really fantastic and positive story we've got within the timber sector, but it's just trying to get that message through, that the more activity we're generating, the more timber we're processing, the more we're putting into buildings, the more carbon is being reabsorbed. The final point is really regarding, I guess it's more specific to the UK in terms of how we still import 80% of our timber from overseas, and if we're trying to use more locally grown, locally sourced fibre, we need to educate architects, people who are specifying timber in buildings, to make sure we can use our timber, which, the timber grown in the UK has a lower density than the Scandinavian fibre, and it's getting that. It's perfectly fit for purpose and lots of very good uses for that timber, but it is a restraint if people are over specifying the grades of timber, that is effectively a barrier for UK fibre. So we've got to get some education on what the quality of UK fibre and what uses we can actually put it to. Okay, so that's my 3 points.
Okay, that's great. Thanks very much. So I'm sure there will be some questions coming in from the delegates, but really to kick off, all three of you have touched on some of the challenges around perceptions of using timber, and you've talked about sort of new ways of using timber in construction through offsite sort of technologies and so on. I guess there is a challenge there in terms of how we address some of that need to change perception. So what is the scale of the issue that we're actually dealing with, and how do we go about upskilling, whether it be architects in terms of how they're specifying the materials to be used, or indeed, the construction sector more widely. What is the scale? What is the nature of that challenge? Mila, can I maybe come to you first?
Yeah, of course. Thank you very much, Amanda. So yeah, I think the scale of that challenge is relatively significant. In terms of people in the use of different timber species and specify them. As part of the timber technology engineering and project, working with Robert, I've had the great fortune to sit in industry working group meetings where we're hearing again and again from various industry representatives how much of different timber species and how can you actually apply those in buildings is currently missing from the existing provision. So I think that that's basically a national challenge. I think the number of learners that we need to address, but you could say that it's across the industry. But in terms of how do we then tackle that? From experience on-demand learning, or just having information available that people can access on the time, at the exact time that they need it, is very critical, because in today's beginning it was clicking a button and getting what we need when we need it. So having easily filterable resources, that for me is very important, and where we already a wealth of knowledge to build in that area. We've got Strata, we've got the Structural Timber Association, many organizations who have those kinds of resources. But then in terms of how do you actually then upskill the people, something that we're working on is challenge-based learning, or is creating problems that people can solve collectively while working in collaboration with different disciplines, and that's to get that practical, more hands-on experience.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's really interesting. I mean, it sounds like we know what the issue is. There's lots of materials out there, but it's how to encourage people to come forward and really respond to the opportunity. Robert, do you have any thoughts to add to what Mila was saying there?
Yeah, absolutely. And Mila covered off some of the points really well. I think that the CITB stat that came out recently with regards to net zero carbon, I think it's 350,000 new entrants required, for to do anything about net zero. So that tells you the significance, I guess, in terms of the scale of what needs to be. And that's simply new entrants, right? That's not even about the reskilling or the upskilling of those that are currently within the profession. And then, in terms of construction, I think, construction. Again, the significant piece here is the landscape of it. So if you think of going from forest floor to built asset and the number of bits in between, from the sawmiller to then the off-site fabricator or the engineer joist, we've got James Jones with us, production or truss manufacturer, etc. And all the different bits need to take place before it gets to actually a built asset. And so you've got all the sort of added value things that go along with that. As I say, sawmilling operations, fixings, the installation, mechanical, the integration of your mechanical, electrical, etc. And then you've got the whole construction process. You've got the client, you've got the main contractor, you've got those that they are then subcontracting, and you've got the architect, the engineer, the cost consultant. You've then got the specialist timber contractor, if it's an organisation such as Glulam Solutions in the Scottish context, which deliver that on site, or the off-site fabricator such as CCG, Stuart Milne, et al. From that perspective, and then you've got all those that influence that process. As I say, from the client, you've got the warranty provider, you've got building control, you've got the lenders, the insurers, right? So if you think of that landscape and all of those within that we need to upskill, reskill, or bring into it, and ensure that they are thinking about the delivery of the built environment in a sustainable manner, utilising renewable natural capital and timber. And it's often been difficult to get timber even into the educational curriculum because of the focus on the carbon-intensive materials of concrete and steel. So there's a shift that needs to be taken place there. So I think the challenge is there, but equally so is the opportunity. And the opportunity, as Eddie was laying out, is really how we can actually help alleviate the climate crisis by sequestrating carbon in the built environment, and that's the opportunity that presents itself. So it needs to be put forward in those terms, because we equally have the stigma of attracting individuals into construction even as a career, and we have the challenge within that even in terms of diversification. We're lucky to have people like Mila that are working in this sector, but we need more Milas, so we need more diversification as well, and equally what that resolves to is this whole human capital piece and cultural change which needs to take place.
And you've got to start early. If you're going to attract people into whether it be forestry, timber processing, or construction, you have to start early so that people make these connections and realise that actually all of these jobs, all of these future careers actually have a link to us delivering net zero. So it's not just about the individual role, it's about what it contributes more widely to society. I think that's a really interesting point. I would like to come back and explore in terms of that upskilling, where some of the drivers are going to come from. So, is this the job of education institutions, whether that be from schools through to to colleges and universities, or is this something that actually needs to be driven by business, and essentially businesses recognising that they need to do something about this, and really they're sort of driving it. So it's where that emphasis lies. Eddie, do you have any thoughts in relation to this subject of discussion?
But firstly, I would say that it is a major hurdle and a major challenge for us. I would, from a business perspective, in the UK, the housing market is dominated by a small number of very large house builders, and they are very focused on price, and it always comes back to the cost of the build, and that's that's where their agenda is. Whenever you talk about introducing a new product, but it'll cost, another £5,000 for the finished house, then end of story. There's no more conversation. So it's got to come from government policy on, building regulations, on insulation. That's going to drive quite a lot, potentially drive the use of timber in housing. And, Robert will testify that the new building regulations on insulation, I think, are a huge opportunity for getting more timber into housing. As far as the education, the point on the education sector you made, Amanda, I think that's very relevant as well, because we need young structural engineers, architects coming through that see timber, see all the positives of timber, and all the courses. Not that I've been on. Robert will be more familiar with this, but they're very focused on steel and concrete as traditional building materials. So we need to get that integrated into all of the educational sort of streams for structural engineers, architects as well. So yeah, there is a big challenge there, definitely.
Yeah. Okay. So coming back to that question, it's good that Eddie introduced that sort of focus on policy, and something I'd like to pick up on if we've got time later on is actually the role of government in terms of driving policy. I'm aware that in places like I think it's in BC and Canada, they've got a timber first policy. In terms of the state government there has introduced. Countries like Switzerland actually they don't just have a forestry policy, they have a wood utilisation strategy, a national wood utilisation strategy. So are these the kind of things that we need to really sort of help embed that use of timber in construction? But, I just coming back to the points that were made there around, I think Eddie made the point about sort of house builders focus on price. I think Mila earlier on said something around procurement. It'd be worth exploring the role of procurement and how buildings are procured, and the role of that in terms of driving decisions about the building materials that are used, and perhaps some of the barriers that are in place at present. So Mila, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, so I think I smiled very broadly as soon as you said timber first policy, because that's something I feel very passionately about. I've seen it implemented in Sweden. In terms of procurement, we are seeing, in terms of policy making, we are seeing, of course, the whole industry coming together to reach net zero carbon, and that's that motivation or the drive and actual momentum, stuff really getting done. But then how do you do that? And what about the cities who want to champion net zero? The City of Edinburgh Council want to achieve net zero not by 2045 but by 2030. Well, in that case, how is a timber first policy not going to help with that, or how would they achieve that without a timber first